So we'll wait. We'll give a little time for this to populate. We see folks coming in. I see Ruth is joining us, and Merv and Mel and new friends are joining us in this conversation on building peace.
And teaching peace.
Building community through teaching peace. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the third installment of Teaching Peace, brought to you by the New York City Council of Mennonite Churches in partnership with Groundswell and the Brooklyn Peace Center. This series is possible through the Eastern Mennonite University's Lilly Foundation grant, Helping Pastors Thrive. This online series meets every Tuesday at 5 p.m. for about an hour. In this series, we're wrestling with the big ideas related to bearing witness to the power of peace building. It's our hope that each of us might become more encouraged and equipped for the work at hand. The word peace in the Holy Scriptures is shalom. This deep peace is not merely the absence of violence. Rather, it's a complete and holistic approach to life and our relationships with one another and creation. Over the course of this online series, we will hear from leaders in the field of peace building and wrestle with these weighty topics. My name is Jason Storbakken. I serve as the pastor at Manhattan Mennonite Fellowship, and I'm a founding member of the Brooklyn Peace Center, and I'm joined by my dear friend Addie Banks. Well, would like to introduce yourself.
Yes. Glad to be back with you all again. I'm Addie Banks, and I am the chairman of the New York City Council of Mennonite Churches Education Committee. And this evening, our guest is Jayne Docherty. She is the executive director of the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University. Professor Docherty earned her PhD at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. And she holds an undergraduate degree in religious studies and political science from Brown University. She's also studied theology at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Professor Docherty consults with organizations and communities in transition, working with them to harness the positive energy of conflict and minimize its negative effects. Her current area of focus is research, writing, and practice on improving the use of negotiation and unstable situations so that the results are durable but flexible systems for creating long-term and sustainable peace with justice. Professor Docherty is also the author of 2 books, Learning Lessons from Waco, When the Parties Bring Their Gods to the Negotiation Table, Syracuse University Press, and something that many of us are familiar with, the Little Book of Strategic Negotiation, Negotiating During Turbulent Times, from Good Books. Jayne, welcome to Teaching Peace. We always begin with this question: how do you define peace?
I would say, just as you just defined it, peace is not just the absence of violence or the absence of conflict. It is rooted in right relationships and justice. And if you don't have justice, then you don't really have peace. There are a lot of concepts in our field, structural violence, for example, as a concept that says, we can't just think about violence as I reach out and hit you. If I am living in a system where I benefit all of the time and you suffer because of the system, that is a form of violence. And very often I think we forget to think that thoroughly about what violence really is. So real peace is the absence of structural violence and systemic violence, as well as the absence of overt violence. So to get that, we have to be in right relationship.
Thank you, Jayne. Good evening. And thank you for joining with us and engaging in this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. You're Catholic, and you share the Catholic social teachings have shaped your faith and your convictions. And many of us here are Anabaptists, Mennonites, and there are a lot of shared values between Catholic social teachings and Anabaptist values. Can you share with us how these teachings, these Catholic social teachings, have informed your vocation, and maybe how you came to serve as the executive director at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University?
Sure. There are a lot of points in my life where I've been sitting somewhere and said, how did a nice Catholic girl like me end up here? Sometimes it's been really bizarre things, like sitting with FBI agents waiting for the Michigan militia to arrive. But I think my whole life has been a whole series of those. How did a nice girl like me end up here? How did I get here? I'm not only Catholic, I'm an Air Force brat. My dad was a career Air Force officer. He got orders for Vietnam in 1967. I was 9 years old. No, I was 11 years old. 11 years old. And I went and checked a book out of the library and read up on Vietnam and came running down our hall. I can still feel what it felt like to go running down the hall. Dad, why are we fighting on the wrong side? They were promised their independence and then the French betrayed them. Why are we not helping them get their independence? And, that started a whole long series of conversations. So I had joined the anti-war movement by the time he got back in '68. And so my kind of journey to this has been through that anti-war activist end, right? Like, this is just not right. Something's wrong here. And as growing up Catholic, and actually in a progressive Catholic family, which I think people sometimes in the peace churches are a little surprised to hear that my family would be really quite progressive. One great-grandfather was a Marxist, right? So anyway, that we were committed to social advocacy and social justice in our family. And I think people don't realize the military racially integrated long before civilian society did. So those were issues that were talked about at our dinner table. And as a result, I got kind of steeped into Catholic social teaching, which I think differs from Mennonite value-based kind of teaching in that it's very rigorous intellectually in the social sciences. So it marries theology and deep theological reasoning with deep sociological, political, and economic analysis. And how did that's a long story.
Wow.
I got hired on the faculty in 2001.
I remember.
So I started in August of 2001. 9/11 happened a month later.
Wow.
We started the STAR program, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, which brought me to New York to kind of see if people were ready to have any kind of a response that would help the communities after 9/11. And then eventually they decided I wasn't going to corrupt the whole program, so they put me in charge. No, it was a really big deal when they hired me.
I bet.
Because I was John Paul Lederach's replacement.
Oh, really?
When he left. He went to Notre Dame. So, fair's fair. They hired a Mennonite, so EMU had to hire a Catholic. It was an exchange.
I heard from him today. I got an email. He wants to go to the Teaching Peace series in September.
Good.
So Jayne, that leads us into the next question, and that's actually when I met you. So that could answer some of this question. Can you give us an example of a peacemaking process that you were part of that was successful?
And I hope you're going to tell us about the militia in Michigan and whether it's success or not.
So it depends. So I think when you're dealing with really complex problems, you have to define success carefully.
Mm.
If world peace breaking out was a sign of success, we're all abject failures, right? I mean, and I think it's really important to say, what is the goal right now for improving things, right? And to be able to measure those incremental goals. So to answer your question about what were we doing with the FBI and the Michigan militia, we were trying to set up a hotline so that if another Waco happened, because during the Waco standoff in 1993 with the Branch Davidians, there were a lot of militia groups that were sort of mobilizing around and making a lot of other people very nervous. And they wanted to create some way of doing rumor control and, you know, kind of dispelling rumors about what was happening. And in that sense, it worked for a while, right?
Yeah.
And now we're in a completely different place with that kind of movement. In the long term, I would say it didn't work so well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a very process-oriented view, and I don't know that you can do a whole lot to declare major success for the kinds of problems that I tend to deal with, right? I mean, I also spent the better part of 4 years in the middle of my time at EMU in Myanmar, Burma, working with the ethnic armed groups that have been fighting for more than 60 years when I arrived, on how do you prepare for a peace process. And there have been some steps forward and many steps backwards, because it's never a linear, clear progression. It's always, you know, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 5 steps forward, 6 steps back. It's really a process.
Last week, one of the questions was for Stanley Hauerwas was, how do you build peace? And he said, slowly.
Yeah.
So moving processes, not necessarily forward, but movement, creating movement.
Yes. And I think that's the place where we often forget. We focus on the centers of power as the measure of success. Did we change the center of power? But if we're going to do this, it's really about changing our culture. And I always like to remind people, look down at your toes, because peace process or peace building starts right there and goes all the way up through all the global systems. And whatever you're doing in your life can work towards that goal, because it is a movement, right? So I ran a daycare at home for children for 4 years, and we had a peace table on every floor of the house and in the backyard, right? I mean, is that making peace? It was then, right?
What is a peace table?
So peace table, you can teach children to use a peace table. Basically, it's a designated table that everybody learns to use. And when there's a problem or a conflict or a dispute about something, the person who has the complaint goes and puts their hand on the peace table and slaps it down there, and everybody has to gather around and try to solve the problem.
You had this in your home as a child?
I did this when I was running a daycare, yes.
Oh, you did this when you were running, wow.
Yeah. And so it's interesting to watch. 2-year-olds will go put their hand right on that table. Yeah. And then, you know, because daycare is not all the same age, to watch the older students or the older children help the younger children figure out, well, you can have that toy for 10 minutes and then he can have the toy for 10 minutes. Jane, where's the timer, right? So, yeah.
So pastors can be using this in congregations, in children's church, micro, macro.
Yes. And you can find instructions for Peace Table online.
And we do it at Groundswell. We create these in schools, so we can bring it forward.
Yeah.
I have a question about language.
Yes.
Last week, Hauerwas was saying that he doesn't like the language of pacifist because it sounds too passive and he doesn't like the language of nonviolence because he says it's saying what it's not rather than what it is. And in your field, in the field of conflict management, the language is shifting from conflict resolution to conflict transformation. Why this change?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people that change happened a while ago. I mean, the program that I'm in offers a master's degree in conflict transformation, and it was sort of the big first one that said that we're moving in that direction. We're 25 years old now. So I think because the idea of resolution seems to imply that it'll go away, but in reality, conflict is a dynamic, and not all conflict is bad, right? And sometimes if you're doing real peace building, you actually need to ratchet up the conflict a little bit. Now, some people will tell you that's my favorite part of the field, but they might be a little biased, I don't know. That I do think sometimes naming what's really going on, especially those deep structural conflicts, comes across as causing the conflict. Mm-hmm. And you're not. You're just saying, this is here, it's real, and we have to address it. But that will get you the label of a troublemaker pretty quickly. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that resolution has very good implications, right? Yeah. I can see resolving a dispute, a temporary thing that doesn't have deep-rooted conflict, deep-rooted implications, right? And you just say, well, we resolve that dispute. Who's going to wash the dishes tonight? We resolve that. Yeah. But if you have a family where it's a chronic challenge of patriarchy or unfair allocation of labor, just resolving it tonight is not actually addressing the ongoing challenge underneath, right? That requires that we transform our understanding and attitudes.
Yeah, and it kind of
reframing conflict, as Lederach says, as an engine for change.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And I would feel like you were saying there's the personal and the social, that we're also being transformed by entering into this process. And depending on what the conflict is, hopefully there will be social change as part of this movement.
Well, and don't think that you do this work without being changed yourself, right? Yeah. For me, the big one was our STAR program, the Strategies for Trauma Awareness Resilience. Mm-hmm. My specialty is negotiation, really complex negotiations that require multiple negotiations at all different levels, but it's still negotiation. Mm-hmm. Which I still thought of as a pretty rational decision-making process when I first started. And then we had the 9/11 attacks, and we did the Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. And in the middle of it, I had to deal with the fact that I had become habituated to a family that was carrying trauma. Right? When my dad came back from Vietnam, we became a trauma habituated. Not that my dad was, I really want to be really clear, my dad was wonderful and loving, and he was never horrible, and he did not do many of the things that people associate with trauma. He's high functioning, but still had stuff that he reacted to, right? And that he carried. So, yeah.
But Jayne, you said that most people in our line of work won't be in the field of professional conflict resolution or conflict transformation at all. They will have other jobs and be in other professions where they will mainstream our practices into their work. And this is a good thing. Where do you see this today?
Oh, I see it with a lot of our students. So some of our students are preparing for jobs or going back to work that would self-identify as justice and peace work. That's their primary work. But many others do other things. They work in business, or they start businesses, right? Or they're pastors, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this is the tension in our field. When you're running a degree program that says it's a professional practice program, but we're not like lawyers where we don't want anybody else to be able to do this, right? I mean, the idea of a profession is to build a fence around it and have hurdles and say, nobody else can do this because you didn't invest in all that education. We're a professional practice program, but we say, anybody can do this, right? Mm-hmm. What you need us for, honestly, what I think our students bring is the strategy and the larger understanding of the process and the leadership component of it. Like, how do you really strategize and think forward? But we hope everybody will embrace the kind of conflict transformation and peace process, right? We actually just started a third degree, which we're launching early. It's a Master of Arts in Transformational Leadership.
Oh, wonderful.
And it's specifically designed for two groups of people. People in the field of peace building and justice who suddenly get pulled from the field and put into management. And they have to know how to run a budget now, and they need to know all of these other kinds of skills. And people who are working in management who want to do it with a more peace and justice lens. And we hope that those two groups of people are going to really be a nice dynamic mix in the classroom. So,
well, we're going to need transformational leadership when we come out of this season we currently find ourselves in.
Absolutely. And it's, you know what, it's turning out to be a pretty easy sell in the middle of a pandemic, because when you say, when everything goes haywire, you need a transformational leader, everybody's going, yes, indeed, that is my life these days.
It's an interesting field. I'm doing a doctorate of ministry in transformational leadership myself currently.
Nice.
Yeah, at Boston University.
Yeah, okay.
A wonderful program. I want to, you brought up your father a couple of times, and you talked about how you had pacifist convictions from a young age. Your dad was a Vietnam vet, and he returned home in 1968, and he learned that you objected to the war, and in fact, you objected to all.
I was sending my allowance money to the anti-war movement.
Really? How a lot of people here probably, or some at least, have gone through that. Myself, I'm speaking from myself. I came to an early realization that I am a pacifist. Didn't mean I acted like one all the time, but it was part of my convictions. How did this play out in your family dynamic? I imagine it played out for a very long time.
We're Italian, so it was not quiet.
Yes.
There was a lot of arguing. And one of the things that I realized many years later, as I learned more about trauma, is that part of the way my dad processed was he would bait me at dinner into an argument, right? About the war or about feminism or about whatever, right? You know, and we would get into these heated discussions, which were a part of our family anyway, to discuss politics in a pretty kind of clear way. But this became very, very clear. But I will say that the thing that my father gave me, you know, when you're a teenager, you say things that you don't really mean. Like, and so at some point I was stomping and I said, I hate you. And he just stopped cold. And he said, that is not true. Love is love.
Yeah.
And you do not turn it on and off like hot and cold running water. And this is politics, and that's completely different. And I think it was my dad gave me many profound gifts, but that was certainly one of them, to recognize that you could be very, very at odds with people. But that is not hate and not love.
Wow, what wisdom. And if we don't have love when we enter into these experiences of conflict, what are we entering into it with?
Yes.
Not an open mind and an open heart.
Yes, and it's not easy to do.
No, it's very hard.
It's one thing to do it in your family, which already has a strong foundation of deep love, but to do it with people who are saying things that you think are just nonsense or dangerous or
exploitative or oppressive.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's really not easy.
Right.
But you had that foundation because you did grow up in a strong faith family where love was at the root. So it's hard to do peace work without having a loving heart.
Right.
It's not possible.
Yeah, you can do the technical parts of it, right? Like you can run a process of dialogue or whatever, but the real change comes. So when I came back from Burma the first time, one of my mentors, I'd been there 6 months, and I've been working with these people who've been in the field fighting, like, fighting a guerrilla war for their entire lives, right? I mean, the general who really said, we need you here and you need to help us, said, I am almost 80 and I have been fighting since I was 14, and this has to stop and it can't end on the battlefield. There's no solution. So when I came back, Frank said, so what do you think the secret is? And I was just like, I don't know. I just love these guys. Like, I don't know why it's working. I don't know why we're having these productive conversations, but I just love them. And he goes, love works, right? So this is a guy who's spent his career doing professional kind of dialogue and problem solving. Just love works, right?
Love works.
I'm going to get my dog. She's whining.
Okay, I'm gonna go with the next question with Jayne. Jayne, you have said that you were just as frustrated with the anti-war movement as you were with the government. They unfairly demonized members of the military. They were more focused on ending one war than on ending war per se. You did say that, and they didn't sustain their efforts to build a more just and peaceful world.
Yeah.
Why do you think the anti-war effort during Vietnam was unable to sustain the movement?
Well, let's go back to Hauerwas.
I'm gonna launch this poll too. Just get.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so should we continue to invest energy into the anti-war movement, right?
Yeah. That's the
Give everybody a chance to answer that before I say something.
your choice. Okay.
I
Maybe
don't
share
know.
what you were saying about Hauerwas.
So Hauerwas says he doesn't like talking about nonviolence. I agree. You get more of what you talk about.
Hmm.
And nonviolence isn't talking about peace. It's still talking about violence, right?
Right.
And it's still making the thing the center. I think the same thing happened with the anti-war movement, right? We ended a single war.
Yeah.
But it wasn't an anti-war economy movement. It wasn't a let's make a globalized economy that actually works for everybody movement. It was, and as a result of not taking on the driving systems, and in fact, I wonder how many people who were out in the streets eventually ended up in parts of the economy where they actually made a lot of money continuing the systems. If we're really honest about our generation, my generation, it's not your generation, my generation. How many people went on to invest in systems that were really predicated on more military spending and that kind of thing?
So we're currently, not to interrupt, but currently 19 of 27 voted. I want to encourage everyone to vote just to see, because right now it's a dead tie between yes at 37%, no at 37%, and maybe at 26%.
Oh, that's interesting. That's where we really are.
I'm going to leave it up for a while and just see if anything changes.
Interesting. I'm not saying not to oppose war. I'm just saying to oppose war is a lot more complicated than people often think it is.
Yeah.
And periodically marching in the streets as we're heading to Iraq or wherever is not actually changing anything. If we really want to end this, we have to find allies in the military, and they are there, who know that this needs to change. Yes, can you assess the Poor People's Campaign as a yes, totally. So I think the Poor People's Campaign, William Barber's Poor People's Campaign that they're revving up, that is a genuine anti-war movement, right?
I'm not sure if everyone can read that question. It's from Sally Youngquist. Thank you, Sally. She asks, how do you assess the Poor People's Campaign is a multi-issue movement from the margins?
I think it's excellent. I think it's picking up where Martin Luther King left off. I think the reason that Martin Luther King was assassinated is because he started to actually get to the root of the economic drivers of both the internal oppression of people of color in the United States and the external war system. Those two things are deeply interrelated, right? I often say that we're not going to end our commitment to the war economy and the war system until we will tell the truth about our histories. And I use plural histories as a former history teacher because everybody has a different piece of it and we all benefit from it. My family didn't arrive here until after the Civil War was over, but we still benefited eventually when Italians became white. We weren't when we got here, but when we became white, we benefited from the racialized system. And until we're willing to actually dig deeply into the roots of this country that are based on genocide, violence, and enslaving people and tell those truths, we're just going to keep going around the world and carrying on the war system, because that's one way to distract from the internal divisions. And if you get me really started, I'll talk about why ending the draft was a mistake.
Maybe go on, share with us a little.
So ending the draft, I think in the long run was a mistake to celebrate as part of the anti-war movement, because now what we have is the poor and the people of color are on the front lines as cannon fodder, and most families are completely insulated from the military system in its harshest parts. And what we have done is we've just created a combination of a professionalized Praetorian Guard that is a professional military class that's less and less connected to most Americans. When I grew up, everybody was there, right? I mean, all different political viewpoints, all different kinds of people were in the military.
That's a good way.
And now there's like a professional military group, and then there's the cannon fodder, who are drawn from the people who can't find work or who are enticed into going in because they'll get an education, which they couldn't get otherwise. It's not good. I sometimes think the best way to promote genuine engagement with a peace economy in the United States would be to reinstate the draft.
Wow. Controversial.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
I've never been accused of not being controversial.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. I see Phil's got a question. He wants us to go a little deeper about the situation you were mentioning before. He said, how do you go into a conflict situation and make peace? Very big question, but then he makes it specific, like with that 70-year guerrilla conflict. Can you share a little about the process?
Okay, first of all, I don't go in and make peace. The only people who can make peace are the people who've been fighting.
Amen.
Right? And I think that's really, really important to remember. And I think it's part of the problem with the large international negotiations is that they hold up, this person as the peacemaker when they're doing this kind of diplomacy or shuttle diplomacy or whatever. The only people who can make peace, the only ones, are the ones who have been fighting.
Wow.
The only thing that we can do as professional kind of people who get brought in is to ask those smart, dumb questions that the outsider can ask. Like, gee, how's that working for you? I mean, in a nicer way than that, right? But truly, I mean, the way I ended up there is I was asked to do a 3-day workshop on strategic negotiation for one of the largest of the armed groups. And I said, well, I'm not from that group and I don't know the details. So the workshop is going to be very elicitative. And 3 days in, it was very informative. I learned a lot. They learned because I came in and asked questions. And in the process of their answering those questions, they started learning from each other that they really, really wanted something different, right? And that there was, because what happens is when you've been fighting for that long, breaking out of the we have to fight and win, just breaking out of that narrative is a huge journey, right? And especially a war that started in 1948, when getting a nation state was the sign of success for you being a people. And now we're in the 21st century globalized economy, and becoming a small, landlocked, tiny state surrounded by China and India, becoming that is not actually a strategy for survival.
Right.
But you haven't changed your analysis or sense of what might actually give you what you truly want, which is protection for your culture, your people, and your language and your heritage, right? And your natural resources. You're sitting on a ton of natural resources. So just being that outsider to say, is there another way to approach this? What are you really trying to achieve? And it is a long, long, long journey. And it's emotional. So the general who was the quartermaster, so the supply person for this group, at one point said to me, "You are telling me that I have been providing weapons and securing weapons for basically my entire adult life, and I have killed people, I have buried my friends, and you are telling me that we have to live with the enemy in the future." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "That's really hard." He goes, "I know it's the only way forward, but it's really hard." Yeah.
Jayne, what kind of impact does people's texts, their faith experience have on this process? We're talking to our pastors now. They're going to think we're getting way out there, like, where's the gospel in this process? What's the impact of people's faith to get them to do this kind of hard stuff? How do they find strength in their texts to do this? What role does that play?
Well, that's really interesting in this situation in Myanmar. Actually, the same general who said we need our way out of this actually was part of he was Baptist and part of a deep Bible study where they were both just diving into the texts and looking at this and looking at it in a way that doesn't just justify the resistance and the fighting, right? And that became really, really important for moving the people, right? Like, you can do all this political analysis stuff here and understand that the future of your people is not going to be benefited by this continued war. But people need to understand why, especially if your church has been saying all these years that resisting and fighting is the way you should be, right? Kind of more relying on Old Testament than they were on New. And then saying, okay, we need to shift. It was a really important part of the process.
Jason, you're up.
Okay, we have a question from Patrick Murray. He asks, if any of us, have you heard of the organization Nonviolent Schools Rhode Island? It's a group dedicated to teaching Kingian nonviolent principles and practices to young people in Rhode Island public schools. I haven't heard of it.
I haven't, but I'm impressed.
Yeah, it sounds
My
wonderful.
family's from Rhode Island originally.
I've heard of them.
You have? Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to bring it back to the scriptures, as Addie led us into. People often think of peacemaking, it's without conflict, or it's just really a peaceful thing that we do by sharing love and kindness and flowers and other such things. But when we read Matthew 18, we see that confrontation is part of living as a peaceable community. What ways have you seen conflict show up when doing the work of peace building?
So I think very often when a system looks very peaceful and everybody's agreeing, that's not what's happening at all.
Mm.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What's happening is whole groups of people are just keeping their mouths shut and not sharing their perspective. Kind of like marriage. Like my parents adored each other and they would get into good arguments, right? And, you know, at one point my mom said, well, if you always agree, one of you is not necessary, right? So if there isn't a certain amount of conflict and disagreement happening in a system, it's not healthy.
Yeah.
It's really not healthy. I think this key is how do we surface it in a way that is protective of, oh, I know, this is the phrase, soft on people, hard on problem. So being hard on the problem is whatever it is, right? The problem is this group of people never gets to have their voice heard, or they're silencing themselves or whatever. And we still are soft on people. We still care and love everybody, including the people who are benefiting from the current system, right? I mean, honestly, if we look at life, we are all beneficiaries of a very unjust global economy.
Yeah.
Right?
Cool. All sorts of unearned privileges, especially for me as a cisgendered male of European descent, straight white man.
Right.
Things I didn't earn.
Right. Right.
And the converse is true.
And it's really not possible to extract ourselves from that system. Right?
Yeah.
Even here where I live, old order Mennonite farmers are participating in the global agribusiness economy, running chicken houses that are tied to multinational corporations. You know, I mean, you can't completely extract yourself from that system.
So this is not on our sheet, but Jayne, you're kind of bringing us into something that conflict is a transformational element, probably in all the changes that we see. If that didn't happen, static.
Right. So Adam Curl has a really excellent model. And it's a very detailed, and it would take a whole lecture to get into it. But what is really clear on it is that peace is not static. Peace is a dynamic system in which we have the mechanisms for naming conflict as it comes up in healthy ways and dealing with it. That is peace. That's a peaceful system, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think about the cross comes about to bring us peace. It's very strange kind of dynamic, but that Calvary March.
Very violent too.
Transformational.
Yeah. Well, and I do think that we have to look at, you know, kind of the myth of redemptive violence and think that through, right? Have we perpetuated that with our theology and the way we kind of think that through? I always, and I'm more enamored of the Christmas story than the Easter story, don't say that. But I mean, the idea that God would love us enough to become us seems to me to be the most, and I'm much more into Matthew Fox's original blessing than original sin, right? You know, as a Catholic, you grow up with all this original sin, and somehow my parents protected me from that. My mom's an atheist, so she had nothing to do with that, but my dad protected me from that. So
Jesus became us, and he became the most lowly among us.
Right.
You know, his mom, unwed teenage mother from the margins of society, and identifying with the hungry and incarcerated and the strangers. For me, that helps to position me in society. It helps to remind me that maybe society is giving me unearned privileges, but how do I use that to shape society so that it's more of a kingdom society where Christ does reign over minds and hearts and also systems and structures.
So I see a couple of interesting questions here. Someone says, what do you think about Colombia's efforts to end their civil war, and how can American churches with connections to Colombian churches work with Colombia's effort? So the interesting thing about the Colombian peace process is that it's probably the most well-designed and the best attempt I've seen for actually doing a whole of system, right? So a lot of times the problem is that the people who've been benefiting from the violent conflict get together, decided they need to end it, carve up the resources and rewards, and everybody else who got hurt gets left behind. In Colombia, they're really trying not to do it that way, and the churches are a key part of that. So, I mean, I can't give you specifics, but I would say that there are many, many churches that are doing really well, and what they're focusing on is a transformational and transitional justice, like really a restorative approach to transitional justice that helps people move through. And so what we mean by restorative is it repairs the relationships, it tries to compensate people as much as you can, and it focuses on building locally, because one thing about war that I will tell you is the war is never one. It's never a single war. It's always a system of wars. And I'll explain that in a minute. And two, it's never a single issue war. What we talk about in the news, forget it. That's not nearly what's going on. What I mean by it's multiple wars is that it impacts different parts of the countries differently. It's driven by resources. It's driven by revenge. Like under the cover of war, this group can get revenge on that group for something that happened 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And so what you really have is a whole system and set of interconnected mini wars underneath whatever this umbrella was. And Iraq was definitely that way. And Afghanistan is definitely that way. Yemen is that way. And so I think we do really a disservice when we don't recognize the complexity of trying to end what are really an interconnected set of mini wars, each with its own driver, right?
So in the restorative process, you're working with the harmed and the harmer. You're not just working with the one piece.
Right. And what they've tried to design in Colombia recognizes that it happened differently in different parts of the country. And they're letting it design the processes for in those different parts of the country will look a little bit differently. They're not prescribing a single, there are some principles, but they're not prescribing exactly a single truth telling, right? It has to be multiple truth tellings.
Mm-hmm. So Jayne, about a decade ago, you were interviewed at mediate.com. And in it, you asked a big question about the future field of conflict, about the future field of conflict management, which you're saying conflict transformation. You asked, will we embrace the challenge of changing the larger culture? Can we stretch ourselves to encompass and address hard issues of human security and justice? Have you found any answers?
So I think more people, very interesting, right after 9/11 was the first convention or conference of the newly formed Association for Conflict Resolution. And I mean, it was like in October, so it was a month after 9/11. And all of these mediators and people came together, and a bunch of people were like, we need to go to war. We need to go fight in Afghanistan. We need to go get these guys. And these were all mediators, community mediators. And that's kind of where some of that question came from, right? Like, are we gonna just like mediate barking dog conflicts, but we're gonna just revert back to this war thing when we get hit? Can we step back and think differently, right? I do think so, and I think this pandemic, plus our phones, our smartphones, right? My mother's I won't give away her full age. She is in her early 90s. She now says when something happens on television, she will say something like, well, he got away with that because he's white.
Mm.
The 90-year-old mom.
Would have been a different story if he'd been black, right? Like the videos are now so clear and so obvious that if people are paying attention, and the pandemic is hitting so unevenly, how can we not say our systems are broken? Becomes the big opportunity to then say, how do we reconstruct more just and equitable systems?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Living wage for the people who are out there risking their lives every day to get you your groceries.
Right.
Yeah.
Access to medical care for everybody as a public health. Even if you don't care about the justice aspect, you should care about your own health, right? Public health is public health. And it's only as good as the person with the worst service. So
we have a hand raised. Don Eng. He has a question. I'm gonna allow him to talk. Don Eng, are you there?
Unmute.
The new feature. Never done this feature before.
Unmute.
I think he has to unmute. Okay.
So if he hits his space bar, there you go.
Guys, I'm sorry. I just moved to my room with my baby girl. I did it not in purpose actually, but I'm enjoying your conversation. Just keep going. I enjoy that. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay.
Thank you. Now we know we have that feature.
Nice.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Don Eng. A next question. On a personal level and on a sociological level as well, a lot of conflict occurs because there are different worldviews.
Yeah.
How do we successfully, maybe that's not the right word, but how do we navigate such differences?
So that is actually what my book on Waco was all about, was worldview conflict. So I had experienced a really bad experience with trying to negotiate a serious problem and ended up getting a PhD trying to figure out how I was never going to let that happen again. And I entered then into that work saying that I did not believe that getting to yes was always the right way to go, right?
Right.
Or that it even would work. And let me see if I can show you the diagram.
Oh, it'd be great.
So what are you guys seeing? Are you seeing a diagram that looks like two circles?
Not yet.
Not yet?
Mm-mm.
Okay, hang on. Now?
Yeah.
So what I've learned from analyzing the negotiations at Waco, where I had the verbatim transcripts to work with, right, from the audio tapes of 52 days of straight negotiation between a religious community and the federal agents, is that when we're talking and negotiating, we actually flip back and forth between two types of negotiation. We use story and symbol and references that to really important texts to negotiate what this context is, what the real problem is, right? And then we use all of that problem solving, getting to yes, et cetera language when we're talking about the specific issue. And we actually do this all the time, but the field of negotiation has not paid attention to the negotiating context, to creating the shared story about what's going on, what's fair, what's good, what's right. And we need to spend a lot more time on that, right? And that's very obvious in the US society right now. And it's being driven by systems. When we dismantled the requirement that media actually have fair practices and speak truth, right? When media operations can say whatever they want, and there's no corrective on it. And that's on all sides, by the way. I'm not picking only on one media operation. We've become a balkanized media space where we can all choose what reality we want to live in. And until we can recreate and construct some kind of a shared narrative about who we are as a people and where we want to go and what we value, we are really headed down a very hard path. So I also see a very interesting question over here.
Yeah.
All right, we've got
You
about 5
support an
minutes.
American draft. How should an American Catholic draftee react to a war like Operation Iraqi Freedom, which is not a just war according to Augustinian guidelines? Well, first of all, here's my radical thing is I don't think there's any just war anymore. I think the weapons systems and the ways of fighting have left that in the dust. There is no just war. I mean, I don't think it's possible to fight a just war anymore. So what would that do? I think at least it would create the space in which people who are in the military would then have those conversations. This is what I'm afraid we're losing with the kind of system that we have, where too many of the people who enter into the military, not all of them by any chance, but there's a core group that then become part of this militarized complex, and then they retire, and then they go get jobs in the military industrial complex, and they reinforce the funding mechanisms and the weapons systems. Meanwhile, I've met a lot of people in the military who know that these wars are not just, who know that this is wrong. And every one of them are probably a lot like my father. If you're in the military for a career, you have a family, you have a sense of honor and duty, you took an oath. It's pretty hard to stand up to it, right? So I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but I think we'd have a better chance of having those conversations if we had more people involved in it than fewer. More people touched by it than fewer.
Yeah.
And I think there's a strong movement growing among Iraq vets, the Afghanistan and Iraq vets, to say this system has to end now. And more people, as we're realizing how poorly we take care of our veterans. I mean, one of the terrible tragedies of this war, these wars that we've been caught up in, are we have whole generation with serious disabilities, right? I mean, this is a long, long, long price tag. I remember one time at STAR, I was doing this whole thing and saying, if you want to calculate the true cost of war, you have to add in all of the trauma, all of the long-term injuries, the benefits. And somebody said, you sound like you're doing a cost-benefit analysis of war and not a theological kind of opposition to war. I'm like, yeah, because if you start showing people the real price tag, their theology, it won't matter what their theology is if they really see the price tag. I don't care what logic it takes to get people to rethink, right? For some people, it's going to be cost benefit.
Amen. Professor Docherty, thank you so much for engaging.
Oh, is it over?
On
Okay.
these.
Just about. Just about. You'll come back and tell the pastors why they need to be sending people to the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding.
Oh, is that what you want me to do now, or tell them later?
Later when we're in a small group.
Yeah.
Addie, would you like any final things to say or share?
No, thanks for inviting me. This was really, really fun.
Amen.
And happy to have conversations with people. If I sparked anything, my email's out there. Go ahead and send me an email and I'll try to answer. I just think it's a long journey. We need to be humble. And I think most of all, we need to not measure success as if world peace broke out, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you do that, it's just too depressing.
Yeah.
You can't even get out of bed.
Jason, you're going to close with the lightning round, and I'm going to just say a closing word.
Sure. We've been closing with the lightning round just to kind of soften the kind of the headiness of these conversations. So I'm going to ask you questions. They're either or. So you don't have to think too deeply about them, but just tell us what your response is. The first question, train or car?
Train.
Phone call or text.
Phone call.
Cat or dog.
Plants.
Cat or dog.
I just created a third option. Plants.
Plants. Oh, I see. That's a good one. I love plants too. Big party or small gathering.
Small gathering.
Star Wars or Star Trek.
Both.
You can do that. Singing or dancing.
Dancing.
Charcoal or gas.
Oh, gas.
Beach or mountains.
High desert.
Yeah. And final one, upbeat or down tempo.
Upbeat.
Thank you for playing. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And
I'm not a very good player. I keep making new categories.
you're a great player. Alternatives are what you're about, so this is fine. So next week, Jason will be taking a break, and I'll be back with Greg Vanderbilt, our seminarian from Union Theological, and we'll be hosting a conversation with our sister Elizabeth Soto Albrecht, and she will be talking with us about family violence and reclaiming a theology of nonviolence. Until then, walk in peace and go joyfully.
Amen. That sounds like a good one.
Join us. Thank you so much, Jayne.
Thank you.